Afternoon. I'm Keith Luce with the National Committee on North Korea. We're pleased that you're able to join us for today's program. We have three distinguished individuals each with a unique perspective on matters related to North Korea and the Korean War POWMIA human remains issues. Today's meeting is on the record. It will be available after the meeting at some point on our YouTube channel. And by the way, as our speakers are making their presentations, if a question comes to mind that you'd like to pose, please submit that through the chat box. This is the third in a series of programs by NCNK on issues pertaining to Korean War POWMIAs and remains. This is an issue often forgotten within the broader context of the so-called Forgotten War. We're exploring new territory in this segment of our series, including the plight of American prisoners taken off the peninsula, as well as prospects for contemporary retrieval of U.S. human remains from the government of North Korea. This is an area of bipartisan commitment and interest on the part of the Congress, and it's one of the engagement links of opportunity between the United States and North Korea. As a beginning for today's meeting, let's review the number of prisoners of war in general at the war's end. These figures have been provided by the Department of Defense POWMIA Accounting Agency. The UN command repatriated 75,800 plus North Korean POWs at the war's end, while over 7,600 North Koreans refused repatriation. It's unclear to DPAA as to what number may reside today in South Korea. It's also unclear to DPAA as to the number of South Koreans unaccounted for in North Korea at the war's end, and the number that may be there today. The statistics are disputed. As of 2007, the ROK government estimated that 560 ROK POWs still survived in North Korea. Many of the Chinese soldiers who were captured were former nationalists who had been enlisted into the Chinese People's Liberation Army after the defeat of the nationalist armies in China in 1949. The UN command repatriated 6,670 Chinese servicemen, while 14,200 plus refused repatriation. It's unclear to DPAA as to what number may reside in South Korea today. In terms of POWs from allied countries, from researching various Commonwealth sources, the DPA estimates there were 180 Commonwealth soldiers unaccounted for in North Korea at the war's end. Well, today, over 7,600 Americans are still unaccounted for from the Korean War. Since 1982, the remains of over 450 Americans have been identified and returned to their families for burial with full military honors. POWMIA human remains issues from the Korean War have received inconsistent attention from US presidential administrations. The problem of US presidents truly making these issues an ongoing priority goes back to the end of the war itself. In September of 1953, US News and World Report reported, and I quote, "So far there has been no protest by the US government regarding missing Americans, except for an Army communique in September of 1952. There is a seeming reluctance by American officials to press the case of the GIs who are still missing. Emphasis instead is on finding a way to make a deal with the Communist Chinese on terms of peace. There's even pressure to speed a United Nations membership for Communist China. Any emphasis on the missing Americans apparently could complicate those proceedings. Military men, unable now to exert pressure on the communists under the terms of the truce, refer to the missing as a diplomatic problem. State Department diplomats, in turn, say the problem of missing Americans is not yet under their jurisdiction and won't be until a political conference with the communists either begins or is abandoned. So they are doing nothing. Meanwhile, news reports about the missing continue to flow in," end of quote. Well, fast forward to the present. There was a season of optimism about this issue following the Singapore summit, when the POWMIA human remains issues were one of the 4 points of agreement between the leaders of North Korea and the United States. Perhaps this point of agreement of the past will be a starting point in eventual renewed negotiations between the US and the DPRK. It's reported that the United States, South Korea, and North Korea are having discussions on an end of war declaration. This would be a remarkable benchmark, providing a necessary venue to address outstanding POW-MIA remains issues from the Korean War. During the war itself, an interesting area reflecting some similarities for both sides of the conflict related to examples of breakdown in order and discipline within POW ranks. As reported in the book, Mass Behavior in Battle and Captivity, detailing the US Army-funded study of the communist soldier in the Korean War, quote, both the North Korean and the Chinese prisoners held by the UN divided into two militant factions, pro-communist and anti-communist, who would fight bloody, life and death battles for domination of their prison compounds, end of quote. Regarding Allied POWs held by the North Koreans and the Chinese, there were numerous examples of breakdown of order and authority among the American POWs. One contributing factor was the lack of training for US military personnel on proper behavior if taken prisoner of war. In addition, extreme conditions imposed on POWs by Chinese and North Korean captors, including food deprivation, lack of medical care and warm clothing, and other forms of torture, contributed to a deterioration of the human condition, leading to thousands of deaths. For those who did survive, with many on the brink of death, spirits broken, and low morale, there was often disregard in acknowledging the rank of authority of fellow American POWs. Too often, each man for himself was the prevailing reality. In his book, Broken Soldiers, Raymond Lech provides extensive documentation of not only the breakdown of respect for authority among US POWs, but the success of the North Korean and the Chinese in particular in encouraging POWs to take action betraying the United States. This tragic disaster of the human condition led President Eisenhower in 1955 to establish the Military Code of Conduct. However, what has happened to those Americans taken off the Korean Peninsula and into the former Soviet Union? What about the American pilots whose planes went down inside China or were taken into China? As we get into the new year, NCNK will be taking a look specifically at the China issue. But today, we're going to have a closer look at the situation involving Americans who were believed to have been taken into the former Soviet Union. We have with us Donna Knox, who has spent years digging deeply into this and other issues pertaining to Americans unaccounted for. Donna is the legislative and policy liaison, as well as on the board of directors of the Coalition of Families of Korean and Cold War POW-MIAs. She is a co-founder of the organization and served as president from 1998 to 2002. Donna is also an attorney with experience in family law and general litigation at a law firm, as well as private practice. Previously, she was a broadcast journalist with experience as a news anchor, news reporter, and field producer. She is a longtime researcher of Soviet intervention in foreign wars and exploitation of American POWs, and she's an author of literary and historical fiction. Donna received a JD from Washington and Lee School of Law and a BA in French literature from the University of Massachusetts. Donna, over to you.
Thanks very much, Keith, and thanks for having me. Thank you to all of you for joining us today. The question of men, American POWs, having been transferred to the Soviet Union during the Korean War is both complicated and disturbing. Over the years, one problem has been, as Keith referenced, that there's been a discernible lack of priority by the United States federal government. Also, Russia, China, and North Korea are the three countries that would have the answers to our many questions, but the US has ongoing tensions with these three countries, and they have for years. Unfortunately, humanitarian issues are often tied to political tensions, and that has created obstacles. I have worked this issue for now almost 30 years, and unfortunately, I haven't seen much in the way of breakthroughs. My personal interest in the issue stems back to my own father's loss. He was in the Air Force in the Korean War. He went down over North Korea as one of a crew of 4. The other 3 crew members were all accounted for. but my father just disappeared without explanation. On that flight, he was operating Charan, which was a new technology that the US had and the Soviets wanted. So that, of course, raises a number of questions. Before the war ended in North Korea, the United States government already was discussing interagency memos about the discrepancies that they saw between the number of men, of American POWs that they knew to be missing, and the number of men that the communists were listing as prisoners. What's more, our government had a lot of intelligence that men had been taken out of the theater of combat. I'll give you one example. There's a CIA intelligence report that was dated in September of '52. It discussed transit camps through which American POWs from Korea had passed either by ship or by rail en route to the Soviet Union. And they had countless other reports about men having been taken. They didn't know what to do about them. They knew they couldn't force the communist hands. They didn't want another war, and they didn't want the American public to know. This was for various reasons, some of which Keith alluded to. They were largely stemming from the executive branch policies at the time, and we can discuss this more during the Q&A if anyone has questions or would like more information about it. For now, let me just say that the US government started gathering data on our missing men, their skills, their education, their experience. The government had started to suspect that technicians were being held back. And we get this from a memo that was issued in December of '53 from the Assistant Secretary of Army to the Army Chief of Staff. Most people have heard of the Soviet Gulag system. It was a system of forced labor prison camps, and its purpose largely was to rebuild the Soviet infrastructure. Now, along came the Korean War. It was the first modern air war, and it introduced new technologies that were electronics intensive. The Soviets lagged behind the US in its development of these technologies and sought to close the gap of what has been deemed theft of design. As a side note, sharashkas were a particular kind of Soviet Gulag camp into which individuals with technical and scientific and other specialized skills were interned. So since much of the Soviet focus in those days was on advancement of its military capabilities, the sharashkas, were camps that were likely destinations for American POWs. So what happened was, first, men were questioned in North Korea on operational and tactical matters. And then, depending on their answers, some of them were selected for transfer to the Soviet Union. Our source for this, among others, is a 1992 interview with a retired Soviet Army colonel named Korotkov, who reported on intelligence gathering during the war in Korea. The Soviets were particularly interested in the US F-86 aircraft. So they instituted a program whereby their MiGs forced the F-86s down, they got the planes, and they captured the pilots. About this time in the middle of the war, the United States Air Force had determined that 666 of its air crew were unaccounted for, and that from an analysis of their circumstances of loss, several hundred of these men had survived their crashes and were candidates for transfer to the Soviet Union. A directorate within the DoD, the Department of Defense, found, and I'm quoting here, "There is almost blatant evidence that this was indeed the case for a number of technically proficient, well-educated, and highly skilled pilots of the F-86 Sabre jet." And in fact, a Russian general named Lubov admitted in an interview that he personally had turned over 3 pilots just north of the front lines between November of '51 and March of '52 because, quote, "the Russians wanted the pilots." This tragedy has been going on for decades, but it is nothing new to our United States government, as has been mentioned already. There were congressional hearings as far back as the '50s, and in fact, I'll recite one to you. It was in the House of Representatives with concurrence by the Senate in May of 1957, and their purpose was, I'm quoting now, "to express the sense of Congress that the President, the Secretary of State, and the Secretary of Defense should make return of 450 known prisoners the foremost objective of US foreign policy. So let's fast forward to 1992, after the fall of the Soviet Union. The new Russian President Boris Yeltsin came to the United States to meet with President Bush. And in that meeting, he admitted that the Soviets had taken American POWs. With this, the families were awakened and we got organized. The Senate Select Committee had a hearing in which it concluded that men had been held back. And with all of this, the POWMIA accounting mission had been ignited. And we, when I say we, the government, certain factions of the government, families and other advocates have been working the issue ever since. It has required research and outreach and advocacy at every level of the federal government. We do have in place now, and have for several years, a U.S. accounting team on this question of the transfer of POWs. It is the U.S.-Russia Joint Commission on POW MIAs. It was formed in '92 by Yeltsin and Bush. Its purpose was to determine the fate of missing service personnel. It continues today. It has researchers, both American and Russian, and they conduct archival investigations. The support directorate for this joint commission has authored 5 editions of an in-depth study of the transfer issue. This series is called the Gulag Study. The first edition of the Gulag Study came out in '93 and the last came out in 2005. The first edition points out one difficult aspect of the transfer issue, and that is that we are unable to tie any sightings and reports to a specific American POW. And we've learned something about why that is. A witness who is a KGB lieutenant colonel, his name is Valery, I can't pronounce this, Lavrentsov, asserted that the Russians changed the Americans' names and that false backgrounds would have been concocted, thus tossing the POWs into an abyss of sorts. So in conclusion, when we look again at the first edition, the '93 version of the Gulag Study, I will quote, "The range of eyewitness testimony as to the presence of US Korean War POWs in the Gulag is so broad and convincing that we cannot dismiss it. There has been some peripheral progress through the Joint Commission. The Russian researchers seem willing to cooperate, and that is much appreciated. Unfortunately, it hasn't been enough. There has been little tangible information that have answered our questions. There are archival records that we need, the KGB and a host of other former Soviet agencies that were involved in the handling and the transfer of American POWs. To date, we still have too many unanswered questions. What will it take for Russia to acknowledge the transfers and fully engage? How many men were taken? Who were they? And what happened to them? We need changes in policy high up in the Russian government. Ongoing cooperation is going to be crucial. We have to find common ground and de-link this matter, which is humanitarian, from politics. As a last word, I will say I've only had time to barely scratch the surface of this complicated issue here today. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you. There are a number of reports and studies that have been conducted that involve in-depth research and investigation and analysis that are available for more information. The RAND report authored by Paul Cole is one of them. The Support Directorate Gulag Study that I've mentioned is another. The Coalition of Families has a number of articles on our website and in our newsletter. I've written some, I will be writing more. All of these resources are available on the Coalition of Families website, to be found at coalitionoffamilies.org. With that, I will turn it back over to you, Keith, and thank you again for having me here.
Thanks, Donna. Given your extensive research over the years on this issue, share with us the resources, the sources of information that you have found to be particularly helpful and perhaps more reliable over time.
Well, I have been doing this for so many years. going through FOIA, Freedom of Information Act, over the course of the time. Sometimes it would take 10 years to get an answer and the document would come back fully redacted except for the date. So that hasn't been very productive. And yet, despite all of that, I look around my office and I have got boxes and folders and notebooks full. So over time, collectively, I have through the Freedom of Information Act from the different intelligence agencies collected a lot. But in terms of going right to a source, the Gulag study that I mentioned, which was conducted by the Support Directorate for the Joint Commission, it's an amazing collection of information, as is the RAND report. Volume 1 of the RAND report deals with the Korean War and the POWMIAs. They have done extensive research and analysis and investigation, and you could just get a feel for the situation with numerous citations and resources just by from looking at those two publications, the RAND report and the Gulag study.
Donna, also, you made reference to the U.S.-Russia accounting team, and you said their work continues today. Can you provide a little more information in terms of how this work continues, what exactly is going on?
Well, the Joint Commission itself has commissioners who are like congressmen and senators, and they're appointed by the president. And then there are working groups for each of the wars: Vietnam, the Cold War, World War II, and the Korean War. So let's take the Korean War working group. There are researchers that are on the American side, and there are researchers on the Russian side, and they hold plenums. Sometimes in the US, sometimes in Russia. There have been issues, political tensions where the researchers were not allowed in one or the other countries. That's what one of the things I alluded to in terms of political tensions. But when they do get together, they discuss an agenda and what they're looking for, what archives they would like to get into, what's possible, and so forth. And then they proceed from there. As I suggested, unfortunately, the real archives that we need to get into have yet to be accessed as far as I know. I have recently sent a list of 7 archives of organizations. They all have acronyms that don't mean anything to most of us, but they were all agencies of the Soviet Union that were in one way or another involved with the transfer of American POWs. And so I'm waiting to hear back from the Joint Commission as to whether or not they've ever been granted access to any of those. And if they haven't, we're going to start a push to make sure that that happens soon, hopefully.
All right. Thank you, Donna.
You're welcome.
We're also today very pleased to have with us Mickey Bergman. This brings us more to the present on the issue of American POW MIA, human remains issues with North Korea. Mickey Bergman works in Fringe diplomacy, a discipline exploring the space just beyond the boundaries of states and governments' capacity and authority in international relations. He is senior advisor to Governor Richard at the Governor Richardson Center for Global Engagement. He's co-founder and president of Capsule Inc., executive director of the Global Alliances Program at the Aspen Institute, consultant to the Clinton Global Initiative, and founder and president of Solel Strategic Group. Mickey also teaches at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. At the Richardson Center for Global Empowerment, Mickey manages private diplomacy efforts in North Korea, Cuba, Myanmar, Middle East, Africa, and efforts to negotiate release of political prisoners. At Aspen, Mickey directs partnerships engaging both public and private sectors in the Middle East, Latin America, and Southeast Asia. He has published numerous articles and opinion pieces in several publications. Mickey, over to you.
Thank you, Keith, and thank you for having us. And thank you, Donna, for this really detailed presentation. I really appreciate it. I learned a lot about the transfer into the former Soviet Union from this. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining. Let me do a little bit of an introduction because we're a little bit of an outlier within the details of the group. So I work with former Governor Bill Richardson at the Richardson Center, as Keith mentioned in the introduction. Governor Richardson, who used to be a congressman, a U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, a Secretary of Energy, and Governor of New Mexico, has always been doing kind of moonlighting as a negotiator or engagement person with some of the people that are the hardest for the United States to communicate with. I think it was President Clinton that used to refer to him jokingly as the Secretary of Thugs. He has that sense in him. He has a gift to be able to communicate and connect with people, whether he agrees with them or not. Following his departure from the governor's position and after 30 years of public service, we established the Richardson Center for Global Engagement. Bombastic name, but we're actually very, very small organization. And part of what you do, of what we do, as Keith mentioned, is working in fringe diplomacy. And let me just explain it very quickly. Two parts of this in general. The first one is engagement. The second one is intervention. And intervention is where everybody gets excited because it's tangible, it's quick, it's sexy. It's just a couple of weeks ago, we were able to bring back American journalist Danny Fenster, who was detained in Myanmar for 6 months. And you know, it's tangible, it's sexy, and Wolf Blitzer wants to do a special on it. So everybody gets attached to the intervention parts of it. But in order to do interventions and be successful at them, you need to invest time and resources in engagement. And that takes a lot of my time and a lot of the time of the governor to do that, because you need to build those relationships. You need to build genuine relationships of trust with people that you absolutely disagree with. And over the years, of course, for us, DPRK has been a hotspot, a place that we wanted to invest, we wanted to work, because there were constant interventions to do, but also because there's worthwhile engagement. And the issue of the repatriation and recovery of remains has been one of the biggest ones for us in this. We believe in showing up. And sometimes, unfortunately, the official diplomatic corps, when there's disagreements or arguments, the first thing we do is that we recall an ambassador or shut down an embassy. And that's the opposite of what we need to do. At the time of crisis, we need to talk, even if we absolutely disagree with people. So we believe in showing up. We're not government. It's obviously easier for us to do that. But showing up is complicated. And we constantly run into conflicting values and ethics, and we have to sort them out for ourselves because unfortunately the world is complicated like that. And we get criticized a lot for doing things, but we're trying our best to calculate and to do what is the better good with this. In this, I believe that the only way to make progress is to have direct engagement. And I do believe that the issue of the remains and recovery of US servicemen is one of opportunity, not only something that the families like Donna, like Rick, like everybody else in the coalition needs to do it for your own interest, making sure that we bring back our loved ones, but also something that the DPRK wants as well. And just the governor himself started working with North Korea back in 1994 when he was a young congressman. He visited there in the Kodel, and at the same time he was there, a Red Cross helicopter was shot down by the North Koreans. One of the pilots was killed, the other one was captured, and the governor stayed there under the instruction of Bill Clinton at the time for 14 days until he basically tired out the North Koreans into giving him the pilots one body and one survivor. He continued his engagement, visited multiple times, and when it came to the remains in 2008, he was traveling there in a bipartisan mission under President Bush Jr. And came back with, I believe, 7 boxes at the time. And in 2016, I had the pleasure of flying with Rick Downs, here, who I love and adore, down to Pyongyang to actually try and reignite the program. And that was before the summit with President Trump and Kim. And Rick did a fantastic job of humanizing the issue of coming in. It was a very emotional trip. And in it as well, we were there trying to revive that program. We're also there trying to see if there's a way for us to bring back Otto Warmbier, the American student that was captured. And like everything else, like I mentioned, there were conflicting values and ethics every step of the way, and we had to work through them as we did that. I would say one thing, Keith, before I throw it back, and hopefully we can talk more in questions. Here's one thing that is so important to me. Often as Americans, and especially because we're passionate about bringing back our servicemen and women, we think of the repatriation as something that is a US only interest, and therefore something that the North Koreans are doing as a favor for us, or something that we need to give something in return for. And I would argue that by my experience, the truth is way more complicated. And in this specific case, I actually believe it's in a good way, because I believe that the North Koreans are very, very interested in having that program too. When we engaged with the North Koreans in 2016, before my trip with Rick, again, we were trying to find a gateway in. We wanted to talk about auto-warmware, we wanted to talk about humanitarian issues. And when we raised the issue of remains, you can literally see the eyes popping open. They were interested. They made the point to us. First thing they did, saying, we are not the ones that stopped the program. It was the US that stopped it back in 2008. And it was, to me, it was an indicator. They wanted it. And here's my theory of three reasons why they really wanted, and I'll close with that. The first one, they know very well how this program, how bringing back our servicemen back home to their families plays the emotional strings of both the American public and specifically the American military. And it's a true gesture of goodwill from their perspective. They see it as a value, a significant value. They understand what it means to us. It was strengthened by the successful return that Rick was a part of the 55 boxes several years back after as a result of the summit. Number two, it's kind of crude, but they do get hard currency for it, for the efforts in recovery, in repatriation, in keeping, and all of these things. They charge and they get currency for it, and it might not be that much, but for them it's very important. And third, and that is the most important thing to me that I've learned, they really, really want the military to military direct engagement. And this is coming, this is not the political side, this is the Korean army, the North Korean army that actually wants that. And we have great partners, and you guys are represented, and you know that with the Defense POW and MIA Accounting Agency, DPAA, with the leadership there, with Director McKeague and Fern Winbush, fantastic individuals, the whole team. They were cooperating and working with us on this non-stop. And I do believe that that is a key. A mill-to-mill kind of engagement is important to the North Koreans, and should be something that we pursue passionately. Let me stop here because I'm feeling like I'm talking too long, and let's go on the questions.
Mickey, great presentation. Thank you. So your presentation brings a number of thoughts to mind, one of which I guess is a question. Is it your sense that North Korea and South Korea would prefer to settle the POW-MIA issues of the Korean War between themselves without outside intervention?
There's certainly, especially after the failure of the series of summits, there is a sense, and with the turn of the administration in the United States, there is a sense that there might have been a decision, a political decision in North Korea to kind of give up on the Americans and look at the South Koreans and see how far they can advance bilaterally on this. It is my sense that if it is a move, it's a tactical one, not a strategic one. At the end of the day, the North Koreans want to sit as equals in the table with the United States. And I think that that's a key thing. They might, again, on a tactical level, might think this is not the right time. And therefore we see that shift. But I have to say, Keith, one of the things that is lingering, and for us, it doesn't seem very important, but I think it's very, very important to the North Koreans. Back in after Otto Warmbier's capture and return, the US administration put a travel ban on the US into North Korea. That put to a grinding halt all of the humanitarian exchanges that took place. The reason for it was security because of what happened to Otto, but in reality, it was a way for the US government to consolidate all tracks and all interactions and all communications to be only the tracks that was running through the Department of State or the CIA at that time. And that, I believe, was a mistake at the time, because we used those humanitarian exchanges, we used those visits. My visit with Rick over there was extremely helpful in getting information and understanding it. But more than that, I believe that that is one of the reasons why the North Koreans have shut down communications through their New York mission at the UN with most of the American entities, humanitarian or civil society. It is not because they don't want to talk to us. It is because symbolically we have shut down all trips over there, and they say, well, if you don't want to travel over here, we're not going to talk to you. Again, it's an emotional plea here, but I believe that lifting that travel ban will actually open up some of those channels and might make, again, a correction on the tactical perception, as if the North Koreans believe that they need to go only with the South in order to resolve it and push us out of it.
All right, thank you, Mickey. And I'd like to revisit a couple of these points during the Q&A session. We'll now turn to Richard Downs. Rick is President and Executive Director of the Coalition of Families of Korean and Cold War POWMIAs, which, as you know, is a nonprofit organization dealing with this issue. Rick works closely with congressional offices, the Department of Defense, NGOs, and so on. He did partner, as Mickey alluded to, with the Richardson Center as it relates to talks with the DPRK and getting the return of some remains. Rick has collaborated with the Department of Army to declassify records containing information on unknown Korean War remains interned in the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific, with congressional offices on legislation to declassify prisoner of war debriefs and intel reports withheld from World War II through the Cold War, and resolutions calling for renewed joint remains recovery operations between North Korea and the United States. He's also been involved in amendments to exempt POWMIA operations from sanctions. Rick's father, Hal, was declared missing in action during an air mission over North Korea on January 13, 1952. And with that comes the transparency that Rick and Donna are in fact related. So Rick, turn it over to you.
Thank you, Keith. Hopefully now I'm on the same page with everyone. Hello, everyone, and thank you for coming together for this wonderful opportunity to share with you our mission and the mission of those of us, many gone so far in the past, but who we are trying to represent in the present and find closure for as many as possible, including our own families. Esther, if you want to bring up, I thought I'd do a little little chart here. This is the Defense Prisoner of War Accounting Agency's graphic for remains returned so far to date. This is as you can see there, September of this year. The breakdown includes unilateral remains, which, as Mickey mentioned, the North Koreans have been very forthcoming in sending back remains whenever they have an opportunity to do so, and the U.S. accepts, which is not always the case, unfortunately. So you have the unilateral returns, you have joint recovery operations, which occurred from the late 90s to the mid 2000s, in which we actually partnered with North Koreans, went to battlefields, disinterred remains, and brought them home. It was a wonderful program covering many of the things that Mickey said in terms of creating a bond between the two countries and unfortunately was again ended by the United States in 2005, not without provocation, but it is usually the United States that is the official ender. There are also the joint disinterments, which you'll see the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific. That is actually in Hawaii, kind of called the Punch Bowl is the colloquial name. And these were remains that were returned following the war and buried as unknowns. They were not able to identify them, and they sat there. It's a beautiful spot to be, but you just don't want that unknown in the headstone above. And they finally, identification technologies have advanced to the point where they're now able to bring those up. And they are midway through on a phased disinterment. And then you mentioned, you can see down there, they are okay, the Republic of Korea. Their MACRI is equivalent to our DPAA, a growing organization of recovery and identifications in South Korea. And they have interestingly started doing what we never thought might happen, and that is demining the DMZ and going in there and starting to search for remains there. Let's see, okay, Esther, if you would, there are a certain number of issues. The Korean War POWMIA accounting mission is made of complex number of just multifaceted issues. You have here the remains recovery, which everyone is most known about, which as recently as 2018, some came back and are being announced. Identifications are being made on a regular basis throughout the year. And we have come a long way in that sense. There are still 5,300 waiting in the DPRK. There is an agreement in 2010 that to resume the joint recovery operations, but that fell through. And again, the United States was the official ender, but there were a lot of other factors involved. But the equipment that was all set to go in there is still in South Korea. And each year the DPAA is funded for an amount to resume recovery operations if they are negotiated. And as of course that has not happened, at the end of the year, the fiscal year, that money goes back into the coffer. So the DPAA is positioned to go back in if the two countries can never get together on the same page, and okay. Identifications, that is ongoing now with the remains that are here. You have the unilateral returns, 55 boxes that came back. You have the punch bowl disinterments, and they are our kind of source of it. If we ever reached an end where that was, well, the wonderful moment when all those fellas are identified and sent home, or the maximum can be, you know, we'll have to be sure to go back and go get some more and provide this. The technologies are just getting, if you get a chance to learn about the technologies that are used for identification now, please do that. There are U.S. air losses over North Korea. These were, as Keith mentioned, there were 600 missions lost and 900 crew members. That some just went up, never came down, never came back. Well, they came down, unfortunately. I apologize for that statement. They didn't come back. So they just no answer. Others, they know where they went down. When in 2016, Mickey and I went, we raised the issue of possibly getting investigative teams to go around to certain of these sites so that we can find out what happened to the crew. Were they lost and buried in the village cemetery? Were they marched off as prisoners of war? This has to be done in order to get closure in this area. Last known alive reports, there are a number of men who were seen in enemy hands during the war, and we know them by name, and they just said we're alive, and nothing ever came. They never came home, and no story was provided about what happened to them. Then over the decades since then, there have been individual, more generic sightings that require some answers, and we don't know for sure how we're going to get those. The POW transfers, Donna explained that in great detail. Declassification, the archives, Donna mentioned the USRJC. China has, of course, POW camps and the background units, the behind lines units that found a lot of air losses. They covered them. But there's working agreements, but not really any substance being produced. Great substance, individual moments, but nothing broad enough to really move us forward. The China archives, China will not open their POW camps and the behind the scenes records be in some sort of deference to North Korea. We should let them, and the U.S. hasn't pushed that part enough. And then in the U.S., we have the U.S. POW debriefings and intel reports, which I'll cover a little bit later on. One of the issues that we have to fight a lot, and it's come up through the entire conversation here, is the governmental policies and the relationships between the governments. There are many various administrations and the DPRK, the current Kim Jong-un has been the leadership of that. And we have the tie-in, unfortunately, with nuclear issues. That's what happened when Mickey and I went. We had an offer from the North Koreans to return do another unilateral return if we got a letter from the administration saying it was a humanitarian issue. And the administration at the time said, no, we're not going to do that because they're not behaving themselves on nuclear issues. The sanctions Mickey mentioned, and we just kind of really would like the leadership. You don't hear the President and Secretary of State talk about this issue very often, and I firmly believe that North Koreans hear that non-mention, and so if it's not important to our leaders, why should they make it important on that level? And so we're going to try to promote that and try to get some awareness brought to it amongst the leadership of our own country to try and create that importance that would help move it along with the North Koreans. And then of course there's time. Time is a big issue because we're getting older, and fortunately, it's been a wonderful development that the next generations are stepping up, and the great uncles, how do you say that? The grand nieces and nephews, and the nieces and nephews, and they're starting to take up the mantle, and so this is not going away. You may remove that, Esther. There are a couple of current things we're missing, but I've gone way over here. Declassification, we're working on legislation with Congress to flip the mandate to where where the government is going to be asked to just go ahead and declassify all these things, and then they make the argument for records that they want to keep secret, and rather than currently the other way around. And then we support, there are issues going on where we can kind of be an intermediary with DoD offices. We were able to provide funding, added funding for the DNA lab, which very complicated, and I have no time to explain it, but there's a lot going on that we can work on now, while the other issues are kind of mired in molasses and are very hard to get going. So I've gone over. Thank you, Keith, and I apologize for taking too long, but it's a lot to say.
Thanks, Rick. Rick, a question. In recent years, we've seen the term POW and then the term human remains sometimes used together. It seems increasingly that the idea of caring about American POWs is no longer on the table. It seems that the focus is only on remains. Is this correct? And in your mind, when did the US government stop emphasizing a focus or interest in the prospect of live POWs still remaining somewhere from the Korean War?
Well, I think Donna covered an aspect of it in that they did not want to bring, the end of the war. It was just a time when everyone wanted to move on, and the last thing they wanted to do was engage again militarily to try and find out what happened to these men. So they kept it quiet, and then they gave a presumptive finding of death for all of the MIAs. And that, for them, for the government, and for families, kind of created an ending that no one knew what that was. Growing up with a father that, yes, he's not here, he's missing. What does that mean? Could he come home at any moment? So I think at that moment, a very strong statement was made that we're not going to pursue this anymore. And then the sightings that came up were hard to get information on. And then when you get into the early 90s, when the mission was resurrected, and you just had a situation where I think the government didn't know what to do with these things, to give them the benefit of the doubt. Could they have done more? Absolutely. But what would that be? They put in requests, we hear about this, and then North Korea or China, or in Donna says Russia, say, well, we just don't have any information on that. And there's a point where they couldn't do anything, so they stopped saying something about it. And that's what aggravates me, is they stopped saying something about it. They didn't keep the issue alive. So what you said is true, and it's basically just a deference to something that they couldn't do anything about. And they just hope it would not come up, and when it does, they've got credible evidence terms. They had deserters that they could use as in North Korea, as well as the deserters, but there were some obvious sightings that they were not the deserters. A number of them were African Americans. So it's just, yes, what you said is true. It's not an official thing. It's just something that is just kind of like, let's hope that it doesn't come up. And when it does, we'll try and deflect it.
All right. So Rick, you've already covered the topic of declassification to some degree, but let's dig into this more deeply. On the US side, is there specific information or records that you believe that if they were declassified would provide more insight into the POW issue?
Well, I think what you said is the correct word. It's insight. It's, for who knows how many of us, we're not going to probably find the closure we hope for in terms of our loved one actually being brought home. But you do have their stories and their endings. And POWs that came back were all debriefed, coming back from their, on the ships, coming back from the war. And many of those debriefings are classified, and they just, were intel reports from the various militaries, CIA, from DIA, from all of the IAs, the State Department, they were all just classified. And to be honest, I don't think that there are individual things that they don't want out still, but a lot of it is just a matter of priority and expense to actually go in there and get at it and get it out and just say, okay, that's it. We're done. Here it all is. It can be researched by anyone.
All right. Thank you. So I'm going to pose a question to Donna, and in the meantime, for those in the audience, feel free to submit your own question. Donna, from Jay Branigan at the Lugar Center, he says, on this joint US-Russia commission, is there any belief that the Americans seized Russian or Chinese MIA POWs from the Korean War? Are both sides of the Korean War working group looking only at transfers into the USSR?
The initial mission of the Joint Commission was for both countries to try to find out what happened to missing service personnel. That is the official mission. I've not ever heard of any accusation that the United Nations Command or the United States took any Soviet prisoners. So I'm not really sure what we can do to help them, other than maybe looking in archives and looking in classified information and so forth to see if we know anything about any Russians that didn't make it home. But I have not ever heard of it being an issue the way the transfer of American POWs to the Soviet Union is an issue.
All right, thank you. Rick, we have a question from John Kim. He writes, regarding Rick's presentation on U.S. air losses over North Korea, 600 missions, does this refer to 600 warplanes or something else? If you could just clarify, Rick.
There were warplanes from fighters to bombers to reconnaissance planes that went down over North Korea.
Okay, thank you very much.
I hope that answered.
That's very direct. So Mickey, I'd like to revisit your presentation. Thanks for the great overview. Just for some additional perspective, you correctly provided background on the cutoff of U.S. contact with North Korea, and which has gone both ways, right? On the good news front, starting with efforts by Deputy Secretary Began under the Trump administration and continuing into the Biden administration, there is a willingness to allow U.S. humanitarian workers into North Korea. As you know, they must apply for a special passport. Where the State Department has recently made some positive progress in my mind is that the department now will allow a humanitarian organization, U.S. group, to apply for an annual permit, a multi-entry permit on an annual basis, versus going in, versus applying for a permit for each trip. So we're pleased. I mean, this is incremental, it's small, but it's progress in the right direction. We hope that it continues. And I certainly concur on the issue of track twos, the importance of track twos between retired military or some form of, shall we say, military representation. And I would just say that on the part of NCNK, pre-pandemic, we had repeatedly made efforts to help arrange a track two between retired U.S. military, North Korean retired military. Other parts of the North Korean government did not support that effort. And so we were in the process of working through a third country, in fact, the military of a third country, to set those up. I know that this area is also one of active interest on the part of Francom and USIP related to the military angles. So I agree, this is important. And you'll recall, I don't know if you can comment any, but when Mr. Pompeo was head of the CIA, he initiated contact with his North Korean counterparts. In essence, this was hardliner to hardliner, right? Now, the State Department was not necessarily pleased by this approach, but what was your make of that initiative on the part of Mr. Pompeo?
Thank you, Keith. So a couple of things, as you talked, like a couple of things kind of popped in, so it might not be in the right order. First, I think that Pompeo, when he opened the intelligence channel, again, smart move. I'm all for engagement wherever it happens. And Pompeo kind of brought it with him from the CIA into State Department. But one would argue he almost handled it in his seat as the Secretary of State, as if he was still the director of the Central Intelligence Agency. So it was very, very focused. Not many people knew, but he wanted it to be a human-to-human kind of interaction, which is very much the way the CIA works, which, by the way, I think is very, very strong and positive. However, again, the banning on all of the other interactions and communications prevented, in my mind, getting other sources of information and getting a sense of how things are progressing. What are the ways it's being perceived by the elite in North Korea, whether it's the party, whether it's the military, whether it's others over there. And I think that was at the detriment of the effort. I have to say, you say, sometimes you try something and the North Koreans are not really excited about. I cannot count how many arrows we shot in the dark in order to get the engagement going. And you just have to cast a really, really wide net. But also, while you do that, constantly look at your counterparts and see what sparks them. And that goes back to my first comment about the issue of the remains. In every single interaction I've had with the North Koreans, the issue of bringing back servicemen sparked them. So that's one of those arrows that always hit a mark with them, in my experience. So I see it as a huge opportunity. Just a couple of other things. I think that we need to look at it, and Donna mentioned it, and then Rick mentioned it, the delinking issue. And yes, both the US and the DPRK link the issue of remains with politics at different times. Unfortunately, we never had an opportunity in which both governments delinked it at the same time, so we could actually establish it as an independent channel. My argument to our own government is this can be such a stabilizing force and supplemental to the nuclear negotiations, because nuclear negotiations and end of war, all of these negotiations on the bilateral are going to be challenging. There's going to be crises in them. They're going to be long. They're going to be ups and downs. And if you have an independent effort on the recovery of remains that takes place, in which there's a dialogue between militaries, there's a dialogue on the substance of it, it's a stabilizing force. So when there's a crisis in one, it can be mitigated through different channels that otherwise don't exist. So I think that is such an important thing to do. I also want for this community, look, there's a movie coming up in the spring called Devotion. And it's going to tell the story of the first African-American aviator, Jesse Brown, that went down with his plane, and his wingman went down after him in order to try and save him. And the movie is being produced. It's going to be, I believe it's going to be a big Hollywood blockbuster, but more than that, it's coming up probably in the spring. I think you can see some trailers online on this. That movie is going to put this issue, again, sometimes you need a bullet, you need something that hooks it. It's going to make this an issue. And I think that us completely as a community need to jump on this opportunity and raise it back again to the level that it needs to be. Bring in the Americans based on the emotional experience of the movie, bring them into this issue, create that pressure in order to push it forward, not only for the American government, but the North Korean government will be watching this. They will be seeing how we respond to that. And last thing, sorry, Keith, one last thing. And that, I know what I'm saying now might be a little provocative, but I do believe, and Rick has witnessed this with me when we were there, I do believe that there is an emotional block that is happening between Americans and the North Koreans. And it is basically on a misunderstanding or a mismatch of Americans. We know, you ask anybody, they'll have 10 opinions of what we need to do about North Korea. But if you ask Americans, why do the North Koreans hate us so much? There'll be blank stares. Not in this community knows, but in the general public. And when you look at the loss that the North Koreans and the South Koreans, the Korean people, suffered in that war, in the millions, 4.5 million, I believe, is the number that is out there between North and South in terms of losses. It's a huge number. It's not too long ago, and it hasn't really been acknowledged. Not a matter of apology and responsibility. This was war, but acknowledging the suffering. Remember, the people that Rick and I met with at the foreign ministry when we were negotiating, these were just like Rick. It was their fathers. It was their uncles. They did every single family. Look, I'm Jewish. I was born in Israel. I was born on the education of the Holocaust, 6 million people. Very different story. But the sheer numbers, only 10 years before the Korean War, I know every single family has been impacted. And if we start thinking about it from that perspective, and I raised it in the meeting with the deputy foreign minister with Rick over there, and I acknowledged it, just saying from my experience, what I know what that means, it changes the dynamic. And I think that that is something that we haven't really investigated or explored within our bilateral approach with the North Koreans. And I think it's a great opportunity to do it. I'll stop here.
All right, Rick, Mickey, I have one more question, but before I pose that question, I'll put Rick and Donna on notice that after you answer, I'll be going to them for any final comments today. So Mickey, if you were sitting in the State Department or the White House, and you have now reportedly North Korea ICBM capability of hitting the US mainland or US interests somewhere. You have the issue of denuclearization. You have the issue of human rights. You have the issue of divided families. You have the issue of POW, MIA human remains. So if you're sitting in the White House, how do you manage these issues? How do you move forward with North Korea? What would be your proposal in that regard?
That's a quick, easy question. Obviously, I'm kidding. It's obviously it's the most complicated question that they're dealing with constantly. For one, I believe that we need to go back into the engagement, and we need to do it with a very, very clear eye. And now politically, you need to have the political advisors advise you how to get the pill to be swallowed domestically here in the United States. But I do believe we need to be clear. If we have our sights at complete denuclearization as a precondition, I think we're delusional. Not because I don't want it. I wish it could happen. But if you understand the way the North Koreans are looking at their identity and at their history, the way they perceive it, they're just not going to do it at this point. But if you look at things like freezing development, freezing testing, stopping proliferation, all verifiable, in return for real movement on the restrictions and the sanctions, you're starting to move, I think, in the right direction. And I would argue, yes, it doesn't take care of all the stockpiles that exist. But I argue that if we have 5-10 years of this, North and South Korea are going to end the war. They're going to come up with a normalization agreement between them. At that point, that stockpile will be less and less relevant, and will probably go into some sort of a custody and removal. It will be less relevant. So maybe I'm naive, but that's the way I would approach it. However, I have to say this, focusing on the remains as a humanitarian issue, delinking it from all this is to me, the highest priority opportunity to build it. Because as I said everything before, I think the North Koreans want it. It's not a favor they're doing for us. I think they want it, and I think we want it. And it's just a way of building up. At some point, we have to realize we can't get everything at the same time. We can't get the human rights. We can't get regime change. We can't get all of those things tomorrow. We have to prioritize, and we have to find what is the pathway, not only that is acceptable to us, but something that the North Koreans can swallow and can see for themselves. If you look at the Vietnam normalization, it's a path, it's a roadmap. At least the North Koreans are seeing it as a roadmap of what might happen or what can happen. We need to look at it not only from our perspective, but also from theirs, not because we agree with them, but we need to understand how they see the world.
Well, Mickey, your comments remind me of the end of war declaration issue. That's apparently on the front burner. And if that moves along, hopefully the issue of Korean War, POW, MIA, human remains issues will be referenced in part of that. Rick Downs, final comments?
I've been wanting to say something that kind of emphasized what Mickey's been saying about the importance of the remains issue to the North Koreans. In our discussions with the Vice Foreign Minister and several others that were there, he spoke, most of the meeting was done through an interpreter, where he read just normal type things that they read and everything, and the interpreter in Korean, and the interpreter shared it with us in English, until we started talking about human remains. He spoke wonderful English, and from there he started engaging with us. So it was very evident the importance meant to them.
Thanks, Rick. Donna.
Okay, I'd like to close with by reference 2 points that were made by the other speakers. One, Mickey's talking about how the North Koreans perceive that we hate them and wonder why, and so forth. And a little anecdote that I mentioned to you, I think is relevant here. I went to North Korea in 2002 on a DoD delegation, and when it was all over, we had a dinner, and there's a big table around which sat members of the Korean People's Army and those of us in the delegation. It was very formal talk, very reserved, and then eventually the conversations broke down to smaller discussions between people who happened to be sitting next to you. And I was sitting next to a young man, we were both in our 40s, he was in uniform, and it turned out that his father was in the war as well, and that his father was still missing all these years, had been missing his whole life, as my father had been. And all of a sudden, we weren't the people who had hated each other our whole lives without even knowing each other or knowing why. We weren't the bad ogres, but we were two people who had suffered the same sadness. And we talked about it and we ended up crying together. I saw him as a person, he saw me as a person. And I think to Mickey's point that we need to do that. We need to forget, or I should say we need to remember that governments are the ones that wage war and engage in politics, but the people are the ones who suffer from those actions. And we shouldn't forget that it's people to people that we should be dealing. And then quickly, as to Rick's point, and mine as well, about the lack of our own government's involvement on this issue of men having been transferred to the Soviet Union. These men fought for our country and they disappeared and they were abandoned. And I think that is just hideous. There has been virtual silence from almost every administration since the 50s, and a lack of interest in at the agency level. The current chief operating officer of NARA, the National Archives, told me a few years ago that there are all these classified documents sitting in record groups in the archives that agencies don't even send anybody over to review for declassification. All of these about the POWs and the missing men, they will have other subjects that are more interesting to them. So we have to somehow get the government motivated from the highest levels to the lowest rank and file to address this issue and bring it to a closure for the families, more importantly, for the men who went missing. And I'll leave it at that.
I want to thank each of you for your commitment and ongoing work on this issue, which is tremendously important. I'd also like to thank Director McKee and his colleagues at DPAA, who have always been supportive of NCNK's efforts to share information broadly on this issue. So I want to say thanks to them. And finally, special thanks to my own colleague, Esther M., for all of her work in preparing for today's meeting. So with that, we are finished. And again, thanks to everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Keith.